Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in Maples Teesdale series of ESG webinars, The Race to Net Zero Carbon from a Development and Investment Perspective. I'm Jo Preece, and I'm a Senior Associate in the construction team at Maples Teesdale and part of Maples ESG Committee. I'm really pleased to be hosting today's webinar, where I'm very lucky to be joined by some fantastic panellists who have all got some great insight into the topics that we'll be addressing today. And therefore, we should have the makings of some really interesting discussion. So let me introduce you to our panellists today. We have Theo Michell, Principal and Co-founder of Bywater Properties, Sam Carlsson, Sustainability Manager at Derwent, London, Paul Martin, Development Director at Firethorn Trust, Jo Croft, Head of Environmental and Sustainability at Overbury and Morgan Lovell, and Chris Ray, Development Manager at U Capital. For further information about our panellists, you can access their biographies through the link in your invite to today's session. Our panel discussion will last for approximately the next 40 to 45 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for a short Q&A session. So please do put your questions in the chat section, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, so that they can be addressed by our panel later. So with the Paris Climate Agreement aiming to radically reduce the world's carbon emissions and to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and with the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, being hosted in Glasgow later this year, the spotlight really is on climate change and sustainability. The construction and operation of building and infrastructure is responsible for nearly 40% of global greenhouse gases. And with this startling statistic, the real estate industry has a pivotal role to play and puts a large burden on the industry to participate in the response. However, being socially responsible does not necessarily mean forfeiting returns. By focusing on ESG, it makes assets much more appealing to a society that increasingly values the benefits of sustainability. Today, we'll be looking at how we can value sustainability and what developers can do or can be thinking about when making decisions about their own portfolios. And with ESG being at the forefront of companies thinking and critical for investors who are looking to make responsible investment, we're aiming to provide practical advice and guidance for those who wish to make ESG central to their developments and refurbishments. So I'd like to start our discussion off by asking our panel, do they think that we can capture the value of sustainability? Paul, if I could come to you first for your views on this.
So it's a difficult question. I think it's difficult to value sustainability at the moment because I think it's still quite new. It's emerging, so there aren't many comps in terms of what an asset would have been worth before, i.e. when it wasn't green, and what it's worth kind of now when it is green. But I think what we can see at the moment is benefits in terms of leasing, so leasing speed, which reduces the void period. So there's obviously a benefit, a commercial benefit there, and I think exit liquidity as well. So you know the purchasers who are available who want to buy a sustainable product are, if they've got a choice of two, I think they will take the sustainable one first. So again, it's the speed of sale where you get that additional benefit or commercial value from sustainability.
Yeah, very interesting. And Chris, can I come to you? Have you found a similar scenario that it's far more from the leasing side where there's a more obvious increase in value?
No, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with Paul. We've spoken to a number of agents, and obviously from a building value perspective, there's obviously minimal real life examples at the moment in the UK in terms of sustainable net carbon zero buildings. So it's quite difficult to actually value a building from that sense or have real life examples. But from a leasing perspective, a lot of our agents are kind of saying it's obviously on trend at the moment. It's what occupiers and tenants want. So we're finding that we can potentially charge more of a premium for our product if they are built sustainably.
Yeah. And Jo, I really wanted to come to you on this. We obviously know capturing the value and measuring the value of sustainability can be quite difficult, but I know that you with others have been developing a carbon calculator, which must be a really useful tool in this regard.
Yeah, so can we capture the value of sustainability? My response is we have to, but the guys flag up the fact that it's not easy, but we have to one way or t'other. So our efforts so far is, and there's lots of pieces of work like this happening in the market. We're obviously pretty proud of what we produce. We've developed our own carbon calculator tool that's just been through third-party audit by Arup and been signed off as compliant with the RICS whole life carbon guidance. What that means in real terms, it enables us to properly measure embodied carbon of projects and of spaces. Till pretty recently, all the focus was on operational carbon, and there's some great things been done over the years with operational carbon, but there's so little insight and so little knowledge around embodied carbon. And with people making all these commitments around net zero, and particularly getting into their scope 3 emissions, there's got to be better understanding of embodied carbon and the carbon associated with all the materials used. So the idea of the tool is for us, first of all, to better understand that ourselves. So we're just using it on any project we can get our teeth into to try and understand what those values are. If you Google embodied carbon in retrofit or in fit out, there's just so little data out there, and the data that is out there is a biased sample size, because they're the projects that have had a real focus on embodied carbon. So you're not getting a true kind of a breadth of the industry. And then once we have this data, we've got to get it out there. We've got to hopefully speak at more events like this, Joe, if I behave myself, and then hopefully put out some white papers. And there's lots of other great stuff happening from other organisations as well. But the data's got to be out there, because developers are, and there's some really great guys on the call here that want to do some really good things, but unless they've got the data to make good decisions, it's really hard to make good decisions if you don't have the information to help inform them.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that's going to be a great tool to help people. Sam, where do you see the ability to capture the value of sustainability? I know that Derwent have they've got their aim to be net zero carbon by 2030.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with everything that's been said on the call so far, and it is definitely, there's an increase in kind of queries from a leasing side, and particularly I think occupiers are using it as a kind of a talent retention tool. I think the Deloitte Millennial Survey says climate change is one of the top, if not the top, concern for new people coming into the employment. But I think on the other side as well, there's a lot more of a focus on green finance, and there's an increase in funds available for that, and so there are different levels, and there's still no kind of FCA equivalent for green finance, but there's some guidelines. So we've used the Loan Market Association's guideline for green finance, and that's just to say your project can only be you will only get the funds to develop this project if you meet certain criteria. And I was in a call a few weeks ago with some lenders, and they were saying that they are starting to kind of up the bar on that, and if the environmental credentials, whichever route you go down, aren't kind of where they need to be, they will start to reject that finance. So it's from both sides of the development cycle that I think slowly the industry is coming on board with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's actually a theme that was very much brought out at our previous ESG webinar in this series. Yeah, really interesting point. Theo, when we last spoke, you made, I thought, a great point that if you cannot capture the value of sustainability, it can make it really difficult for developers to make decisions, which really leads itself into my second question today of what are the differences in construction that developers should be thinking about. And Theo, Bywater has recently won an award for your net zero development in Vauxhall, the Paradise Scheme, using cross-laminated timbers. And I think it'd be really interesting to understand some of the decision-making processes that you went through when designing this scheme.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think picking up a couple of the points that have been made so far as an intro into that, I think you're absolutely right. Putting a value on sustainability is quite difficult in terms of monetary value, for exactly as we've said. There's just so little evidence of what the shift is. But when we started the design process on the project in Vauxhall, we were very clear that nonetheless there is a tangible benefit. You can just sense that in the marketplace from the conversations that we've been having, and we've certainly been, there's no other word for it, interviewed, grilled by tenants who would not accept even a viewing of office space until they've heard the credentials of the building. And that was a case up in a project we've done in Glasgow. So in terms of the project in Vauxhall, we really started from the position that regardless of the fact that it's difficult to actually put a number on the benefit, there is nonetheless a benefit. And particularly working in an area where we are there, the micro location, we felt strongly that to deliver another standard, if you like, office building was not going to make that stand out. So we started from the premise of looking for how could we deliver a healthy workspace and a zero carbon workspace. And the quick conclusion that we came to was that a pivot to looking at a mass timber solution for the structure had such overwhelming benefit in terms of where that took, particularly to, again, another point raised earlier, the embodied carbon assessment of that project. I mean, in terms of operational carbon, as we've already said, I think there's been a huge amount of progress in that over recent years, and you're perhaps in the realms of marginal gains. But in terms of the embodied carbon in the structure itself, timber certainly moved that project on really significantly. So we pretty early on decided to take what was quite a courageous decision really, and pursue a full timber route. Yes, and
so where do you see where would the issues be with going down the timber route? Is it with an insurance point of view, was that okay to address?
There's a number of issues. Certainly insurance is one of them. It remains a significant issue, but really what lies behind the insurance point comes back to this basic point of evidence. There's not enough of these buildings being delivered yet. It's the same reason why it's difficult to quantify the yield advantage that we're absolutely convinced is there, and indeed the leasing advantage. As soon as you try to put a number on it, at the moment it's quite difficult, and that's the same issues that the insurance industry have at the moment, because they don't have enough test cases. But nonetheless, we feel it's really important to pursue mass timber as being a part of a wider bucket of initiatives that the industry needs to follow.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Joe, can I direct that question to you? What do you think developers should be thinking about and focusing on if they want to move towards a net zero carbon target?
Yeah, so it's tricky when you come after Theo explaining his wonderful timber building, because my issue with new build is very much not that level of new build, but the traditional steel and concrete structure. In the prep call we had, I was rightly scolded for perhaps glossing over the S part of ESG. So we just purely from an environmental point of view, just on my soapbox for a moment, retrofit will always, 99% of the time will be superior to a new build from a pure environmental point of view. Certainly if you're comparing it to traditional new build, not some of the innovative stuff Theo and his team have been doing. But what was rightly flagged up to me is looking purely at the E and ESG is possibly a bit too narrow thinking, and to gloss past the social impact that a new building can do to an area, or a series of new buildings can do to an area, which can completely change the face of a city and is so important in so many ways. Is I was rightly called out on. But just purely from a carbon perspective, I would always argue that if you're able to take an existing building and retrofit it to meet the needs of the local users, that's always going to be a carbon benefit over a brand new building. But developers have got to think about more than just one topic. Easy for me to say as a sustainability manager, just keep banging the carbon drum, but there's obviously more factors at play in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. But from a retrofitting point of view, what have you seen that people are using mostly to help with the sustainability angle?
Yeah, so I mean, again from a carbon point of view, it's and just going back to my comment about embodied carbon, and as Theo was saying, there's a lot of easy wins there because it's just not been explored. Operational, you perhaps are at marginal gains, but on the embodied side, there's just, you can just avoid certain materials. Is obviously the simplest things. You're trying to avoid your concretes, your steels, your cements, your glass. But then really what you're after is clever design. So, and there's some really clever designers out there essentially trying to design less. And again, it seems obvious, but the less stuff you put into a space, the less material you use, the lower the associated embodied carbon. So that's a big part of it. That obviously requires clever people than I coming up with clever ways of making a space functional and usable and still a great experience for people, but without filling it with all the material required traditionally.
Yeah, great. And Sam, how are Derwent approaching this? Are they in a similar way?
Yeah, it's the kind of new build versus retrofit is always a debate, particularly when it comes to embodied carbon. And on the social side, it's you kind of really have to engage with the community that you're building in, because sometimes that building has been there for a really long time and you don't want to just start again. And then on the leasing side, you need that discussion to say, okay, you're not getting or your shiny new building, but these are all the things that you are getting. And so it's those discussions on both sides that need to be had. But yeah, we've got a real push on embodied carbon at the moment in our developments, and for the last few years we've been carrying out embodied carbon assessments on all our projects, just to start getting that data for our buildings ourselves. And then now it's looking to set targets to reduce those. And so it'll be interesting over the next few years of how I think it's if you are going new build, you have to really engage really engage with your supply chains and push them to make sure that they're also exploring all different if you've kind of selected a material, that they're exploring all ways to make that material low carbon. So if you are going down the concrete route, looking at cement-free concrete, which is similar kind of discussions as timber, because it's not necessarily charred that much. But a few years ago, recycled concrete wasn't commonplace, whereas now in any building that does have it, it has. So I think we just need to go through all those steps, like with timber, to say, okay, this is new. What are the barriers? How do we get over those? Because we need to. And so, that's what we're focusing on over the next few years.
I think that's really interesting about the supply chain as well. How do you measure that throughout your supply chain? Have they got, is it through the tender process? And
yeah, so largely through the tender process, and making sure that in our employers' requirements, but also if our designers are specifying products, that you're asking the manufacturers these questions really early on. So if you can't get the kind of the right certification, if that's what you need, for example, for embodied carbon, the environmental product declarations, if you can't get it on your project, you've started that process. So by the end, or for the next project, it's there. And it's really about pushing the industry each time. And then also just in general, we've got the kind of supply chain standards in all our contracts, and it's, from a net zero carbon point of view, it's asking those questions to help bring them on the journey as well, and to really try and get everybody involved, because nobody can do this in isolation. We all need to be working together to overall reduce carbon in all the scopes.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's really bringing everyone together, isn't it? Nobody can do it in isolation, especially the targets we need to be hitting. Paul, I know when we had our prep call, you mentioned that Firethorn are beginning to stop using contractors when they're not focusing on sustainability themselves.
Yeah, I think, again, it's about supply chain. We build a lot of warehouses, so we know what kind of carbon footprint per meter squared is a good building and what isn't a good building. So what we push on to our contractors is a net zero carbon building in the brief, but then we also put into the contract a kind of benchmark in terms of carbon. So if they exceed that in their kind of detailed design, then they get penalised, but if they beat it, get rewarded. So it's just an extra incentive for everybody to keep being creative, because this is an emerging thing. It's not developed. There's, I think there's plenty of opportunity to improve on where we are now, and I think it's important that we incentivize people to do that. I think, I'd like to come back to what Theo's done with the timber frame building. That is trailblazing, and it kind of, Theo said it was a courageous decision, but it really was. And without people making those courageous decisions and trailblazing for everybody else, it's very difficult, because actually, in terms of insurance and debt and all of those good things, those people are, in my view, very computer says no, and I haven't seen it before, I don't understand it, so I'm not going to do it. So, Theo is pushing over those barriers for everybody else. So once there's an underwriter that's insured it, then the other underwriters will look at it and say it's insurable, and it's much easier for everybody else. So, I think just hats off to Theo kind of making those bold choices, because it is a big decision at underwrite stage to do what nobody, or very few people have done before, and it's kind of unproven.
Yeah. I mean, if I just quickly respond to that, I mean, first of all, obviously, thanks. But timber isn't new. The UK is full of timber buildings. Some of them go back to the 17th century. It's been around a long time. You look over at Europe, and there's a huge amount of timber. So I think just on that one point, without dwelling on it, we do have a little bit of a blockage in the UK on this point. And on the insurance point specifically, we're doing a lot of digging at the moment around, for example, in the Nordics, in Austria, over in Australia, Lend-Lease have delivered a fantastic timber frame office building. We're continually being told that the world insures itself through London. So somewhere sat in London, there is an underwriter who is comfortable with that, just not in their home market for whatever perverse reason. So in terms of taking those courageous decisions, I think, and I think this goes through a lot of the conversation we're having today. It feels to me that there's a kind of a groundswell building in terms of timber. We may be one of the first, but there are others, and that goes right across the ESG spectrum. I think there's a whole load of courageous decisions that are being taken, about to be taken, because I think there's a collective recognition finally that, as an industry, we've got to do something about this. And also there's a lot of very exciting territory here if you take those courageous decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, sorry, I just want something I did want to pick up with you, an article that I read that you wrote about smart sustainability, and I thought that raised some really interesting points, and just wondered if you could talk us through your thoughts on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's about thinking about sustainability a bit more than what the badge is, what looks good on paper, but what is actually genuinely sustainable. So for a good example of that is kind of electric vehicle charging. So everybody, I think most people are sure that electric vehicles are coming and they're the future. So on the face of it, EV charging is a really good thing, and we could cover our car parks in EV charging. But if you delve into it a bit more, it's an emerging kind of technology. It's a new thing. So the EV chargers that are available at the moment probably aren't going to be the EV chargers that people are using in 5 years' time, because it would have improved. Technology would have improved. Batteries will be different. So it would be easy for us to put 20% EV chargers in our car parks, but probably as of now, maybe 2 or 3% of those would get used. Maybe in 5 years' time, 5-6% would get used, and by that time they're probably out of date. So someone's going to have to rip out the extra 15% that's never been really used and put the new current technology in. So for me, that's not sustainable, because although on the face of it, putting 20% EV chargers looks good and everybody says, oh yeah, you're a great sustainable developer, if you know that actually no one's ever going to use most of those bays before they get ripped out, each EV charger has its own carbon footprint to make. So actually that's not sustainable, that's counterproductive. So really what you should do, which what I believe, which is what we do, we put 5% in now, and then we duct the rest of the car park for future provision, so that as and when the kind of final technology emerges, or the, you know, the 5% that we provided are kind of fully utilized, the operator can put in, you know, an extra 10% of the current technology, and that's, I think, just being a bit more kind of clever than just putting in and ticking the box and saying to everybody, aren't we great, look at all these EV chargers.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's sort of an extension from the greenwashing sort of theory, isn't it, really, that, you know, you're just doing it because it's the thing to do, but you need to think more outside the box than that. So no, I think that was a really important point. So I'm going to move on to our third question shortly, but can I just remind everybody that if you want any questions to our panel later, if you just pop them in the chat function, that would be great. Okay, so our third question then, how can developments and refurbishments be dealt with to ensure that ESG is at the forefront? Now, Chris, I know at U Capital that you specialise in creating unique places that celebrate heritage and focus on the beginning for wider community benefit. And it feels like you're really looking at the S in ESG over at you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we look at obviously when we look at our projects, I mean, our sort of slogan, if you like, is building inclusive communities. So we look for positive social impact, which is at the core of our development and our real estate. So we focus on creating value to society. We got sort of three drivers on that, and I suppose the first one that we always, the first question we ask ourselves when we look at a project is, does the project create societal value? And then secondly, we'll look at, can we be instrumental in enhancing the value of the asset? So we'll look from obviously what our experience and what we've learned from the projects that we've done, and how we can benefit society and the community by delivering that project. And then thirdly, I suppose we look at is the project on the right side of change regarding climate control and the environment. I mean, we look at the developments we're doing at the moment. We're looking at sustainable construction, so whether it's modern methods of construction, whether that's modular, whether that's timber, like Theo was mentioning. And I say we've got two projects at the moment over in West London, two quite large projects, and quite challenging in terms of one being sort of grade 2 listed, and obviously a beacon of the community. So really there we're just trying to interact, and we've really engrossed ourselves with the local community to understand what they want, what their concerns are, obviously working very, very close with them. And then just down the road we've got another project as well, which is a market, and that market's been around since sort of the 1900s. So again, it's very, very precious to the local community, and obviously we want to try and rid of the bad press that's been sort of associated with it, with some developers that have tried and failed at the moment. And again, that's just it goes around our ethos, really, of trying to work with people to create something that benefits them and work collaboratively. I mean, we've got a scheme there which we've got space to put different asset classes on, but we don't want to just put an asset class on there which is just going to maybe benefit us and not benefit the community. So again, that's about us engaging with them to find out which asset class works with them, which is going to increase footfall for their market, and obviously bring them more customers, which is just something at the moment which is unfortunately, and obviously the times that we've gone through, it's very, very challenging.
Yeah, and I think sort of really centering on the community, it's allowed you to develop projects that have failed in other people's hands previously, hasn't it? I think.
Yes, yeah. No, so there's been, say, the one over in West London, there has been a number of that have failed, and I suppose that maybe is the bad developer tag that goes along with a lot of developers, that they may have just tried to implement something that they feel that obviously gives them the returns, but that's not necessarily what the way that we look at things. Obviously, we see a lot of our returns is obviously benefiting in the community and giving something back to them, as well, and obviously we have a lot of hurdles in the development process that we have to get through, and to get through those hurdles we need the community on side, and we need them to feel like that we're giving something that's benefiting them.
Yeah, completely agree. Theo, what are your thoughts on this? Is that a similar perspective?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think you know, again, there's a fundamental issue for our industry here, and there's been some recent studies looking at what people's perception of developer is, that word, the connotations, and they are pretty overwhelmingly negative. And for me, I think what I find really interesting is, from a historic perspective, the sort of buildings that people so often feel such affinity to were delivered by the developers of their day as well. They were delivered for commercial benefit, but somehow we've seemed to have loved those historic buildings. So it's something in the way our industry has gone about doing what it does in recent years has really turned people off. And I think that is certainly a lot around consultation, but for me it goes a little bit beyond that. It's around control. And I think Chris used a phrase there of giving something back. I think that's really important, but it's also important to recognize that for some communities, they have a sense, whether it's correct in a kind of a legal sense, that it was theirs in the first place. It wasn't to be given back. It was taken from them in some sense. So we're beginning to look at opportunities where we can, particularly over in Belfast, in one instance, of kind of community trust type models. And for me, a lot of this is about relinquishing control and being seen to relinquish control and giving over where you can decision making around things like tenant makeup, tenant mix, and even rent level, giving that up and being seen to distance yourselves from those things, particularly as they relate to the regeneration of town centres and as they relate to the streetscape and street fronting retail and these issues around the high street. And I think if we can find a way of having the confidence to let go a little bit and give back to the community at the beginning of a project, not at the end, and let them be involved and make and lead some of those decisions, I think that might help redress the balance of the kind of poor way in which developer community seems to be seen at the moment, which is really sad.
Yeah, really getting rid of that label. Thank you. Sam, would you like to add anything on this?
Yeah, just to say, I completely agree with what Chris and Theo said, and for us, we kind of work in villages, and because we have a few buildings in certain areas, it's really working with the community continuously, and kind of asking them what we can do for them, and it's not just kind of a one-off thing. It's that continuous relationship, and I think in supporting our community kind of involvement is, you can really tell that when you've built up the trust, and you can have that back and forth discussion, whereas at the beginning it is that kind of there are those barriers. So it's trying to figure out those barriers. And then just on the other side of ESG, kind of looking at the governance side, I think there's going to be an increased focus in that as well, to make sure that all these commitments and everything that everybody's working towards, there's no kind of greenwashing, and so I think we're seeing it from our investors, but also just how it's integrated at all different levels of the business now. There's a real focus on the government side and how being held accountable for what you're committing to, which I think is really beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, have you got any further thoughts?
Yeah, it's great listening to these guys, and these clearly developers that really think about how they interact with their local communities. But I'm going to get my soapbox and slightly critique some other developers who aren't on this call. But yeah, it's just around the localism issue, and I think at times the fetishization of localism, insofar as interacting with the local community and making them feel part of it, and hopefully actually making them part of it, is all real and is really important stuff. But what we often find is that leads into, often with very good intentions, I think, requirements around local procurement, so that there's a requirement for X% of the project spend to be spent locally, which is really, it's done with good intentions, but everywhere is local to somewhere. And if everyone in Liverpool insists on only spending money in Liverpool and everyone in Manchester only spends money in Manchester, then those two cities don't benefit from the kind of cross-pollination that they could give each other. And although it seems like a good thing and people would feel like they were doing a positive thing for their local area, it doesn't necessarily help the local area if no one from outside the local area is going to procure anything from within it. So it's again, just warning people around, certainly in the procurement end and large-scale procurement end, that we could be trying to do something good, but potentially bringing about unintended negative consequences just on the procurement side. And everything else from a local perspective, certainly interacting with communities is all super positive stuff. So I don't want it to sound negative on that side.
Definitely not negative. Brilliant, thank you. So this leads me to my final question for the panel session. Does net zero carbon work for one asset class more than others? Paul, maybe we could come to you on that.
Well, thanks. Another good question. I mean, you know, we don't work across all asset classes, but from my perspective, it seems as though it has to, because otherwise it's just not going to work unless we can make it work for everything. It's, you know, we're going to hit a dead end. So, and I think it will probably go full circle to where we started about viability. So once we get to the point where we can demonstrate and the markets know and everybody knows that there's additional value to be had by delivering kind of sustainable buildings, then there'll be more value to be had, and so it will become easier to deliver sustainable buildings than it will to deliver non-green buildings, if that makes sense. So I think it has to cover all sectors, and I think it will, and I think in the not too distant future the comps will be there to show that actually, you know, especially the big institutions already will pay more, and you know, they will refuse to buy buildings that aren't sustainable.
Chris, can I come to you for this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, really. I mean, we deliver all different asset classes. I mean, I suppose what we do find is there are restrictions on different asset classes. So in terms of building regulations, I mean, you can't use certain sustainable materials in some asset classes, which obviously then impact your net carbon emissions. And then on the insurance side as well, it's similar there. So you'll get some buildings will be insured in a certain asset class compared to another which won't be in that asset class. So it's a tough one to actually answer. I hope that doesn't really answer your question to give you an asset class from that side, but it is, I suppose we just find that there are differences in terms of those each one of those restrictions really that are sort of it's a difficult one to give you a definitive answer on.
No, and you've got to look at so many different aspects of it, haven't you, when you're making those decisions. So yeah, no, get that point completely. Theo, can I address that one to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, first of all, to agree with and highlight one point that was already made. You know, every asset class must find a way. I mean, you know, I don't think there's a free pass here for anyone to say, actually, I'm in this asset class, so it's too difficult for me. I'm exempt. I mean, you know, we need to find a route through this. I think also for me, this plays back to a wider consideration of the refurbishment point as well. And you know, we're very supportive of the refurbished first approach. Most of what we do at the moment is in the office sector. We're by no means new build. We're predominantly refurbishing offices, but I think there needs to be some recognition as well that the building stock is not universally of a standard that necessarily is worth saving. You know, it brings an interesting dimension here that we don't talk about enough, I think, in our industry, which is time. You know, I mean, to my mind, the reason for continuing to build new as well as refurbish is that we should be building new for the next 100 years or more. So it does strike me that part of the answer to this question, which I don't have right now, is actually around which asset classes are more adaptable than others. You know, I suspect there may be some asset classes out there that are hard to refurbish in a way that is really going to give them longevity for for decades and decades to come. There are others which potentially are highly adaptable, and there's no reason to change the structure. So I mean, like others, we don't work across all asset classes, and I suspect there probably is a little bit of a spectrum here, but as I say, no one gets a free pass.
No, holistically, it's a bigger picture thing. Thank you. And Sam.
Yeah, I mean, as we've kind of all said, it does need to work for all asset classes, and I think maybe office is our main thing, but just in the industry, that seems to be where most of the kind of, not always, but a lot of the pioneering or different schemes start. And so maybe in order to help other sectors, it's making sure that those, where there are lessons that can be shared, is that we are cross-pollinating to other sectors so that they don't have to start from square one again. Maybe that's something that we can help with. And I think it varies as well, because in retail, for example, there's a lot more of kind of just general consumer energy use or consumption, just in terms of kind of lighting, for example, and so there might need to be a lot more behavioural change in other sectors, and so it's trying to drive that behavioural change and again say why we're doing what we're doing, and why we have to do it, to try and get those other sectors on board as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. And finally, Joe, do you want to add anything on this question? Joe? I think we've lost Joe for the time being. So.
Okay.
You are. Hi there. Sorry, Joe.
Nothing to add.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our panel discussion today. So I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that have been entered into on the chat section for our panel to have a go at answering. I'm not sure whether we might do. Let's see whether we get through them all. If we don't manage to get a chance to answer them, then we'll send them to our panel later. So do put any more in if anybody wants to know something. So let's start with Andrew Greenway. He's got a question for the developers. Have any studies been done on your existing building stock to understand which are the worst offenders in terms of carbon emissions? Then are retrofit plans considered to address these? Is this the primary focus on new or existing properties? That's right. Let's start with Theo then. Are you able to give us your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to break that down, have we done studies? Yes, we have. We've just finished a review of our last 4 delivered refurbishment projects, looking at the embodied and operational carbon that that was expended as part of our works. What was interesting about that was we did that as a retrospective exercise, and I now really appreciate the power of having done that, because I can see how that is going to frame our procurement going forwards. Because to be frank, having done that retrospectively, we realized that there were some really easy wins there that we could have taken, that to be frank, we just weren't thinking closely enough about at the time, and that obviously is a frustration to us, but it also I think raises a point of going forwards, how we not only procure but how we brief our design teams is really critical. And going forwards, we're saying on all of our projects, do not let an opportunity go past because of my ignorance about any one particular thing to suggest this product rather than that product. Because, as I say, to make the point, having done this exercise, we realized that actually we could have done better had we A, thought about it, but B, empowered our design team enough to step up and say, actually, have you thought about this? So yes, we've certainly done it. We're also looking at, because I think part of this question is around worst offenders. One of the things we've started looking at is work that's been going on at UCL, University College London, on a London energy model, looking at the existing building stock of London and trying to work out, is there a typology here thinking particularly about office buildings here, but you know, is there a particular typology that gives an opportunity for intervention that has more, you know, better prospects than others? And you know, that's early stage having that conversation. But my sense is, I guess, two things. First of all, the point here around, are there worst offenders that you can turn around? Yes, I suspect there's work that can be done there, and we keep coming back again, thinking about offices, to questions about facade, and do you refacade or not refacade, and where we can go in terms of sharing a narrative with prospective tenants around why we've chosen not to refacade a building, because it's not necessary. That's one issue. I guess the other thing that lurks in the back of my mind is the worry that the worst offenders may be the ones that the industry doesn't want to touch. And you know, there's a kind of natural instinct here to pick up the relatively easy wins, you know, the buildings that you can take that are not great but are improvable, and therefore what happens to the ones that are truly bad. But that, you know, that comes back to my point around refurbishment and new build. There's a balance here, because ultimately what we need to aim for, I think, is building stock that is fit for purpose for the longest period of time possible. So I don't know if that answers that one.
I think so. I think it's good. Sam, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and yeah, it's definitely, well, something that we've done. And in terms of focusing on the new and the existing, we've kind of set standards for our new builds and our development projects, but because we own and manage a lot of our portfolio, we've done extensive assessment of our existing assets, and we do know who our worst offenders are, and it's sometimes can be quite surprising. And so it's looking at what we do now is setting kind of energy targets, and making sure that we know what we need to achieve as a portfolio. And we've kind of put it down to individual buildings, but going through that discussion to say, okay, and how much can we push this one building or all our buildings? Because some buildings there might be more opportunity than others, and then we have to kind of balance those. And part of that will be looking and engaging with our tenants to try and say, okay, these are the targets that we've met, and these are some of the steps that we need to take, kind of looking at operating hours or set points or whatever it may be, just potentially engagement programs, to try and reduce that energy consumption. And then on the other side, on the embodied carbon side of our existing portfolio, we're also looking at how we make sure that we capture that when we make changes to those, because you can't just look at embodied carbon of your major refurbs or your new builds, and it's trying to estimate what our kind of carbon budget is so far. But it's kind of early days of those, and looking at different ways of carbon accounting and such.
Yeah, great, thank you. Does anybody else want to have anything to add on that one?
Can I just chip in and stitch Theo up? Theo, it's really great to hear you just basically being honest about some possible missed opportunities. But the fact that you've done that exercise, I feel like a lot of other organisations won't have even done that exercise, so won't even know what opportunities they're missing. Are you potentially in a position to put that out publicly? What things, not necessarily right this second, but at some point put that out there? Because I feel like that'd be really valuable to the industry to know what those things were that you didn't do, but perhaps could have done. Yeah,
of course. And I you know, I don't want to take too much credit for this. We've leaned heavily on Field and Clegg Bradley Studios, who sounds like, similar to yourselves, have developed a carbon tool for assessing buildings. Our timber frame building was delivered with Field and Clegg, so we've leaned on them. The other projects weren't Field and Clegg projects, but they kind of use their tool to, you know, retrospectively, as I said, analyze them. It's a hugely important thing to do, and so has taught us lots of lessons, not only about how we would go about the design in future, but things, for example, like setting carbon budgets and supporting a contractor if they don't have those skill sets with something like the FCB tool. I know, you know, it sounds like you're well ahead there, to help where they need it, analysing the procurement decisions that they're making.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so shall we move on to the next question then, which is from Dan. Is zero carbon in new build materials mostly achieved by offsetting? It's an interesting question. Paul, have you got anything, thoughts on this one?
I'll take it, yeah. I think residual carbon has to be offset. So whatever you're left with so you have to build the building to a certain standard, you add up all the carbon, and then that residual carbon at the end has to be offset. You do all the mitigation you can, and there is some at the end that has to be offset. But I think, offsetting is it's not a kind of one-dimensional thing. It's not, I think everybody well, maybe not everybody, but the perception seems to be, I'll just, spend some money on, a scheme in the Amazon, and, I'm just paying my way out of effectively greenwashing by paying money. But there's more to offsetting than that. So, one way of offsetting, for example, would be to put solar panels on the roof of the building. So, some of our buildings are 1 million square foot, and so that's a massive footprint. They can generate 3-4 MVA of power, and they will be generating that for 30 years. So you're offsetting your build carbon through the life of the building, and it's so it is still offsetting, but you're not just paying money to, an organisation in another part of the world. You are doing it locally, and you're doing it on your building. That's still offsetting. And for example, another site that we've got, we put the infrastructure in, the power supply from a waste to energy site to our building. So waste to energy power is carbon negative because it would have been waste before. And so again, for the life of that building, 40 years, there's a carbon negative operational gain to be had, which is offsetting your residual carbon. So the short answer is yes, everything that you're left with at the end, you have to offset to be zero carbon, but that doesn't mean that you're greenwashing. There's lots of ways to do it in a really kind of, and there's some really great vested schemes that kind of have that social element attached to it. So it's kind of women in Kenya who wouldn't have had employment planting trees. So you get your carbon, but you also have a real good social benefit as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to it than just offsetting, but there is generally offsetting on new build developments.
Yeah, thank you. Joe, maybe do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Paul's saying there. Yeah, not all offsetting is creating equally. Is it created equal? I think sometimes it is treated as a bit of a dirty word, which I think is a shame. There's no shame in offsetting. Doing proper, robust offsetting is taking responsibility for the emissions your operations have produced that you've not been able to avoid. So I think we need to. I'd like to not treat offsetting as this awful thing. Obviously, it's far better if we can avoid the emissions in the first place, but where they really can't be avoided, then if you're taking responsibility of going and finding a really robust carbon offset, I'd point people towards the UK Green Building Council put out some really good guidance on what good offsetting looks like, and that's a really good guide that will help people procure good offsetting solutions over perhaps some of the ropier ones that Paul alludes to that definitely exist. There's definitely some double counting issues as well to be aware of with offsetting, which companies, going back to the governance piece that Sam's talking about, with everyone making these commitments around net zero, there's going to be a lot of internal governance, but there's also going to be auditing firms that are going to take advantage of, in a good way, of doing proper carbon accounting for people. We're probably going to get I would imagine some badges. There's going to be specific kind of company accreditations that can be achieved that are going to come out in coming years, where companies are going to go through a really robust audit, and that's going to include an audit of your offsetting solutions, I would imagine, and particularly ensuring you're not doing double counting. So a bad version, I'm not saying this is what you're doing at all, Paul, but a bad version of such things will be taking the kind of offset generated by your solar against your embodied, but also against your operational going forward, and you can't take it twice. you're avoiding that carbon, and you need to make sure you only take it once. So a good auditing process will eliminate that kind of aspect.
Yeah, a really important point, I think. Does anybody else want to add anything to that, or we can move on to? I think we've probably got time for. Sorry, Sam. Did you want to mention something there? Just so you came off.
Yeah, you've got to follow that hierarchy of reduction first before offsetting. But I think that was it.
Super, thanks. So I think, look at the time, we've probably got time for one more question. Let's have a look at Halusi. They ask, I think it's an excellent point regarding communities' views of giving back what was already ours from a social perspective. What are the top 3 principles / targets should projects be focusing on? Chris, maybe you'd like to have a look at that one, given what we were discussing earlier.
I mean, from our perspective, a lot of it is obviously, I say, is engagement. Is engagement with the society, which is one that we try is a big principle for ours. So it's really engagement, and then obviously giving back the asset class to benefit the community or benefit the asset locally, and then thirdly, really again, it's our social value. So providing something which is sustainable, which is a sustainable building. So I think those are the 3 principles, targets that we look at on most of our projects.
Great, thanks. And anybody else want to add on that one? Theo, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add. I'm not sure how I'd rank the kind of 3 principles. I mean, for me, the number one always is just transparency and honesty. And you know, we find often when we're engaged in conversations with communities, local communities, interest groups, that there's this pervasive feeling that somehow the development community keeps its cards close to its chest somehow and doesn't share, and they listen but don't reciprocate maybe. And some of the most successful things we've done has been to sit down with people and explain in some detail a development finance cash flow, for example, which was a surprising thing to end up doing in a public consultation meeting. It happened to be someone who was from a university. That then led to me giving a couple of lectures to undergrads and postgrads from this particular university, because you know they felt really strongly oppositional to aspects of development, but actually didn't really understand the development process or the constraints that we had. So to some extent, the more open and transparent you can be around not just listening, but explaining your constraints, your financial realities, where the drivers are, how you are trying to broker a balance to make things happen, that has always been positively received for us. And we've always had this sense that actually one of the biggest failings for the development community, particularly around financial issues, is this sense of you're not really sharing, you're not really being transparent, which is, you know, the example I gave earlier, which is a example from work we're doing over in Belfast, where, you know, we felt it was really important to say early on, you know, in this case, big mixed use, or big in the Belfast context, regeneration scheme, you know, the retail piece here, the shop fronts on the street, which are old Victorian terraces that have been derelict for years, they're not really that financially significant to us in the overall scheme. And we're very transparent about that, and that leads you down to this route of looking at establishing a community trust, because we can afford to be much more open and let go of some control there. So for me, the number one principle is just to be more transparent and open, and break down this myth of the developer being some character who's got, you know, all the money, all the cards, all the power, which we all know from the inside is, you know, is very often not really the case. It seems like that from the outside.
Yeah, you need that collaborative approach to really make things go forward. Brilliant, thank you. Anybody else want to add anything on that question? So it's that. Okay, great. Well, I think I'm just having a quick look at the time now. I think it's drawing to the end of this session. So any questions that we haven't answered, we will send those on. So thank you very much for people that have added their questions today. I hope you've all found it very interesting. I know I certainly have, and I'd like to thank all of my panelists today for their time and thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar formed part of Maples Teesdale's ESG webinar series, and you'll be able to find a recording of both today's session and the previous webinar, ESG Putting Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, which was hosted by my colleague Anna Klein a couple of weeks ago, on our website and on our YouTube channel. So thank you everybody for attending, and also if you've got any questions following the event, I'm sure we can pass those on to our panelists. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you again soon.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.